everyone, welcome to the Game Dev London podcast, a community of game developers and game enthusiasts talking about the one thing that they all love the most, games. My name is Nichola Humphreys. You can refer to me as she, her. I'll be your host on the Game Dev London podcast for today. And today we are joined by fellow game dev at Shark Mob Game Dev, Steffie. Steffie, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hello, nice to be here today. I'm Steffie Garcia. You can refer to me as she, her as well. I'm a senior UI artist working at Shark Mob at the moment. I love all things UI, UX. It's my big passion. So hopefully today I'm here to let you know how fun it is and maybe make anyone who's thinking about joining the games industry become a UI artist too. Thank you.
Oh, thanks for being on, and thanks for saying yes to be on the podcast. So before we get into the topic of conversation, all about the power of UI, I'd like to throw an icebreaker question at you, just so then our audience can know a little bit more about you, and just get the insights and behind the curtains of who is Steffie. So my icebreaker question for you is, if you get to be part of any video game universe, which would it be and why?
Okay, it's a good question. Thinking about it, I'd probably say it would be the Spyro games. You can probably see in my background, I have a little Spyro-y toy there. Those games, they go back a long way for me. As a kid, I played through all of them quite obsessively. I think it's just something to do with the really amazing worlds, the details of them, the fantasy aspect. You could really lose yourself in the immersion there. And it was just really fun, quite lighthearted as well. So there was a consistency between them as well, that each time you played one, you kind of got more engrossed in it. It was a really, really good time for me playing those. There's certain interesting parts as well. I was just thinking now how, in terms of UI, they had some kind of interesting sort of mechanics where they'd show, say, instead of a normal health bar, like a UI 2D health bar, they would have the character Sparks, who is this little kind of sidekick of the main character, Spyro the Dragon. He was a little dragonfly, and he was actually used to show how the character's health was at the time. So he started off as a gold dragonfly, and then if you took damage, he would then turn blue, green, and eventually it would disappear. And you would replenish your health by feeding him, by attacking fodder characters, which he would then be fed on. It's like flies that came out of them. But it was really engaging, really kind of interesting, just one of the interesting aspects that made the game really lighthearted and fun.
And I feel like with ways that you can show players' health in such an innovative way can be seen in more modern games as well. For example, in Journey, where the length of the scarf is actually the player's health, and I've always found that super interesting, where UI and UX can be used in such a unique way rather than just like a 2D health bar.
Yes, I think I completely agree. I think there's certainly always space to be a bit more interesting when you're designing games. So sometimes it's quite hard to do that while you're making a game. It's one of those things which, when someone manages to achieve that, it's a big, interesting thing, but also can be quite iconic for the game as well. That these kind of types of UI, they don't really feel like UI when they're so integrated.
So. Oh, most definitely, yeah. And that almost rolls into our topic of conversation today, which is like the power of UI and how it is so important to video games and why it is so important. And with that as well, with UI, it's separated into two chunks, which is diegetic and non-diegetic UI, and non-diegetic UI being the information that is communicated to just the player, whereas diegetic UI is stuff that the player character can see. And I feel like it's always interesting when both of those versions of UI are really explored and, like you said, make such an innovative UI that people will remember for ages, even after the game is released.
Yeah, I think you get this kind of funny thing as well, where some people will say like, "Oh yeah, you can tell something's really good UI if you actually don't even notice it's there," as in if you can fully immerse yourself without even noticing it, which is, I suppose, one way of looking at it. That doesn't always work, as in you can get bad experiences where you're searching for information and you can't find it. But that kind of super immersive experience where you've got all the information you need, but you're not really even noticing it. That's a kind of holy grail level of UI in games. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And like for those who are listening to the podcast and might not know what UI is, just from my research, I've found that it stands for user interface, and it's mainly used for on-screen buttons such as the health bars and inventory and skill trees and menus and stuff like that. But I'm curious, from a UI perspective, as someone who is very, very good at UI, how would you define user interface?
So the user interface, I would define as kind of everything that the player is using to interact with the game. It's that kind of entry, like between the user's mind and I guess hands or body, however they're interacting, and to kind of be able to control the game, but also get the information they need to fully play the game, as a kind of most basic way to explain it. It's that kind of area where you're not really, you're thinking of yourself as a human at that point. As a player, you want to just feel like you are the game. You're in the game, and you don't want to be feeling blockages between what you want to be doing next. I think that's if that makes any sense.
No, that's a great definition, and it's always good to get definitions from people who are very passionate about UI and are in a position of UI as well, because then you can really get like the true raw definition of what it is rather than just having a quick Google. But earlier you said that UI has been your passion for a while now, so I'm curious, how did you get into UI and what was your journey to where you are today?
Thanks. Yeah, it's a funny one. Like a lot of different people that they can get into UI positions from different ways. As in, some people will study graphic design, and other kind of things like design roles. I actually started as I've forgotten the word for it. I want to re-record this. What's the word? Not generic. I don't want to say generic. I'll write it down. No, generalist. That was it. Anyway, yes, I started out as a generalist, like a junior artist in games. That's my first role. I'd studied 2D animation at university, and I hadn't really thought about games. But then, due to someone working for a not very well known at the time company, Marmalade Game Studio, they were, I think, just starting off trying to make quite a lot of kind of small games as work for hire, and they were looking for junior artists. So I kind of had applied, not really having any games experience, but having a like 2D animation degree and doing some 2D animation work and illustration work, and having a bit of Maya 3D modeling knowledge, or doing a bit of that. I'd started as a generalist, and I was doing anything from modeling character animations, like illustrations, and then also UI as well. And at the time, we were using this software called Flash, which you probably know it now as Adobe Animate. But it was quite a common way to do UI, I think, a while ago. You'd be using this kind of middleware called Scaleform to kind of to create assets within Flash, and then you would use Scaleform to get the UI to kind of work in the game project. And that was kind of interesting for me, because I was getting to do this creative stuff like drawing, animating characters, creating UI, but then also being able to get it to work. There's a whole technical side to UI as well as creative that's quite interesting, engaging. You have to make sure that your assets are well optimized, because with these kind of UI assets, you can end up either making the game run really slowly, or if it's say if your assets are too large in size, or not efficiently sized, you can end up crashing the game. So you have to be quite careful with how you put things in. And then also there was another side, as I was working on the UI for these kind of games, like the initial games where they were work for hire for Hasbro. So we were doing things like Littlest Pet Shop, and I think a Transformers game as well. And so as we were designing these menus, I was kind of, not just looking at the art side, but also thinking, like, how can we make this a better experience for players? How can we make sure that the information is correct, or is the best it can be, so that there's a big iterative process going on there. And so I was thinking more and more about this stuff. And then as the projects went on, I was gravitating more towards the UI-based things. And that's kind of how I started really getting into it and being really passionate, because it's quite nice as a role, because you can work closely with designers like you, and coders as well. So you kind of become this sort of central person who's communicating with lots of different people, and it's a good place to be. So that's basically how I got into it. And then after that, I carried on working in other studios in UI-based roles, or doing leadership roles, but then UI focused as well. So I started out mostly doing mobile games. So the UI was quite important on that particularly, because a lot of those games can almost be entirely UI based 2D games, or where you're, as a player, you're just working with a lot of menus a lot of the time. So the role I'm in now is the first one, which is a AAA game. So we're looking at controllers, PC, that kind of thing. So it's a bit different.
And that's all super fascinating. It's interesting to see, like, where you come from and where you are now, and how you got to that position. You mentioned that you used to work on mobile games. So would you say that UI, or the approach to UI, is different for working on a mobile screen versus a computer screen?
Yeah, I'd definitely say those two, they're very, there are some similarities, but they're certainly quite different. And that's one of the things about creating UI, is that you always have to think what is relevant for how the player is going to be using the UI. So on a mobile game, you have a lot less space, like a lot less screen real estate. You expect people are using very small devices, and even within mobile, people have different sized devices they'll be using, like very sort of from older models of mobile devices to huge iPad Pros. and that kind of thing. So, and obviously the way that players interact with the devices are quite different as well, as in you're using your hands to control the games and to navigate through menus, whereas on a PC or controller-based games, you'll be expecting players to have kind of larger screens or to be sat a distance from their screen as well, rather than holding them right up to their faces. And also just the way people think when they're using these kind of games, they're quite different. So the users are always going to be quite different as well. So yeah, there's quite a lot of difference within those kind of platforms, I definitely say.
Yeah, and I can imagine like the exploration into VR as well is like a whole nother approach as well, because the player isn't confined to like a four-sided screen or a circular screen. You never know. But instead that they're not really confined because they are within the world, and it's hard to have like a standard HUD for a player when they are constantly looking around as well.
Yes, certainly. From my experience of playing VR games, you have this kind of, the control systems need to be very different. You have to be very aware of, I guess, the player's own ability to kind of stay in the game without getting a kind of motion sickness. The move controllers, because I've got a PSVR, and that's another kind of interesting interaction method. So you're kind of you're kind of trying to control the game as if you have a pair of hands or pincers. It kind of seems like the way that you use the move controllers. But yeah, when some games do try and have like more traditional menus, that it can be a bit odd. I was playing Skyrim on VR, and trying to navigate the menus can be a bit hard to deal with, because you're trying to replicate that kind of full screen menu, and it feels quite unnatural when you've got this 360-degree viewpoint as a player. You can end up feeling quite restrictive. So yeah, I can see how when someone's trying to design for VR, you have to really think very differently.
Yeah, that makes total sense, and I almost feel that VR falls more into more more diegetic UI, because it's what the player is seeing themselves, and it's not the information. Is that the correct one?
Yeah, I'd say
Yeah,
diegetic.
yeah.
Yeah.
So the stuff that they can actually see and like interact with, and for example, in Beat Saber, when the box come towards you, there's like a little arrow attached to each box to say like, oh, you got to hit it going upwards or hitting it going downwards, rather than like a Guitar Hero esque UI where it's like, okay, you got to hit these buttons in a particular order, or a DDR is a better example.
Yes, I definitely agree with that. You've got things where the menus tend to work really well when they're kind of positioned on some kind of item in the world, because I think that just makes more sense to you when you're immersed that way. And it's kind of nice when, like, I guess non-VR games do it too, but it's definitely a challenge trying to often get those things to fit. I suppose with VR, in a way, it could be easier because as a player you can kind of get up close to menu elements, whereas if you're trying to design for diegetic UI in a, say, a PC or console game, you've got restrictions like are things readable when they're at kind of strange angles, as in usually things like lettering and numbers, that they can be quite detailed and hard to see. So as soon as you start skewing the angles, it can be a bit of a challenge. So you might end up having to go back on those things when you're designing. But,
Yeah, and I guess like the perks of diegetic UI in VR is that if a player can't see a piece of UI that has like text or numbers on it, they can always just bring it close to their heads and read it as if they've got like a pair of reading glasses on, or yeah, or even just like even put it further away if they feel like it's too close. Like they can physically play around with the UI depending on what they want to see.
Yeah, so I imagine that's really an interesting one. I haven't done any VR UI myself, but I could imagine it being quite an interesting challenge.
And yeah, I feel like UI is so important to games because the players need information, because every game is completely different from each other. They're almost like snowflakes. It's every game is so unique, so you need to have unique AI that suits that project. So I'm curious from a senior UI perspective, what would you say makes good UI? Because I remember you mentioned that Spyro has great UI, so I'm wondering if you have any additional examples of great UI that you've seen in video games.
Yeah, so I'd probably say, like, generally, for that question, the question is, actually not the question, but I would say this all depends on like the suitability of the UI for the game, as in, if you're making a match-free game and you've got a particular demographic, your audience in mind, these are the kind of games that they're used to playing. So you tend to, you might do a UI that's, say if it's aimed at like middle-aged female audience or something like that. You might try and make the game a bit more attractive and maybe more casual in style. So you might get more I don't know, like pink colors or flowers or this kind of thing, and things like you might choose softer shapes for buttons, maybe make things quite I don't know, like polished looking, like very very shiny maybe, or have more glows around things. There's a kind of style that it needs to be relevant. Like you wouldn't make if you're aiming for that audience, you would make something look, I don't know, like horror buttons or something. And I think it goes that way culturally as well, as like games UI might be really great for, let's say, like in a Japanese RPG or something, where they'll prefer more information being shown up front than for a Western game that might not be considered good UI for that audience, where people have expectations of cleaner UI with less information being shown up front. So I think those expectations are definitely, they play into what someone might be playing the game think, this is a good UI. So I think there's that side of things. There are some things, say if we were looking at, say, just Western UI, there are certain principles which you can follow that I think they would work for almost any game. As in, you might make some text larger, or some an element larger if you want it to have to be emphasized. So some people might call that affordance, where you say you want to really get a call to action to be really visible. So you'd make that brighter, possibly add movement to it, as in, as a principle, something moving is going to catch the player's attention. And certainly if you want to show something as disabled, you might make it darker or slightly with a lower alpha. And also things like if you group items together, then that can kind of make it seem to the player that those things are related. So I think that there are certain principles that you can follow that would make the UI understandable. So there's definitely there's two sides really. There's a kind of the user experience, which is how the player, I guess, everything around like the UI and the game as a whole, but say looking at UI, the thinking behind it, but before you go as a UI artist to add art to the user interface, it's that kind of thinking, like, is this going to work for the player? How is this system going to work as a whole? And is it good? Is the player having fun? Like, once you've got that UI in the game and you're testing it, you're checking, like, is this going to work? And yeah, it's being quite empathetic when you're making your UI. not just thinking, oh, I think this is understandable, so therefore it's good. You really have to try it with other people and think what others think when they're playing the game.
No, that makes sense, and like that sort of mindset can almost transition into game design as well, where we're thinking in perspective of what the player would want for this particular game. So it's putting yourself into that mindset of what would the player want rather than what do I want to see in this project.
Yes, I'd certainly say one of the interesting things about UI in games is that crossover amongst disciplines, where I suppose for developers you'll have the UI/UX can cross over with game design very quite in quite a strong way. So you might find some designers will do some like UI or UX design. Some UI artists might find themselves doing quite a lot of like close work with game design before, say, a feature's even been decided yet. And that's one of the really interesting parts of the UI in games, is how you can just kind of cross over in that way.
Yeah, and I can see that a lot with the crossover with art as well in projects. So, for example, heading back to diegetic UI is seeing UI on the Pit Boy in Fallout 4, or like with the scarf mentioned before in Journey. It's like I feel like UI intertwines with like 3D or 2D art, as well as like the general information that comes from game design as well.
Yes, definitely. I think when it comes to art is something that it's really important, as in, say, for the user, when you're playing a game and you're looking, say, at the UI, even when it's like a non-diegetic piece, if it's the art isn't kind of conveying what we're wanting to convey, whether something is a positive experience. Sometimes you might have something like a pageantry moment. Say you've completed the level and you want to show the player that they've done something really great. We really want them to feel good about what's happened. That it becomes quite artistic. It's the kind of thing where you might pass it over to some animators and say, go and animate this character having a really cool dance, get some VFX involved. We want explosions of rainbows happening. You might get environment art involved if you've got some gacha box being opened and you're like, okay, this needs to happen in a really special place that makes sense in the rest of the game. That you could end up, I guess, having quite a lot of crossover with art to really get to really kind of hit home those emotional moments for the players, and that's even when it's not just part of the normal gameplay. So that's a very interesting part of creating UIs and having some diegetic stuff as well.
Yeah, that almost like, because you mentioned sort of like gacha, and that makes me think of loot boxes, and I feel like a great way in which UI and art was combined without being part of the core gameplay loop was just before Overwatch 2 got published, and it was just Overwatch when specifically players would open loot boxes, because when you'd open a loot box there was like a combination of VFX of like stuff coming out of the box, and then there was the 3D models of the characters if you got a skin or if you got coins, and then if the player unlocked a voice line it would be shown through a little UI portrait of the character to say like you have a voice line, or you have a new emote, sort of thing.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think as well, another good example of really fun gacha is things like Fortnite with the pinatas. You've got these, I guess, quite physical objects. They're even alive. It kind of adds this kind of comedy element that's also really fun for the player to be kind of hacking open their prize. And it's a really good way to kind of get that emotional response from the player.
And you mentioned as well that having the player interact with something and then get presented with the UI also reminds me of playing the series Devil May Cry. When, for example, you'd hack into a creature, and then you'd have like these signs that come up that says "awesome," "super epic," and just to be like, "Oh, you're doing a great job, keep it up." But in a more hardcore sort of like heavy metal aesthetic.
Yes.
So that's probably one of my favorite parts of UI is just like when you can use that to tell the player that they're doing a great job with the stuff that they're supposed to be doing, sort of thing.
Yes. That makes me think as well. We've got that whole thing for when, say, almost like the opposite, like how you show when players are not doing such a great job, like how can you kind of so direct them into what they should be doing, is the other kind of challenge in sort of UX and UI. So some games, a bit like with the I guess the health bars, we talk about Spyro and the kind of diegetic way of showing health. You might get some games like The Last of Us 2. I thought did this really nice thing where instead of having your kind of obvious health bar, you also had the character Ellie, she would get more tired as she was dying, and you'd see her like panting. And I think that was a kind of nice way of adding a kind of emotion and a kind of narrative to the to back up the sort of the health aspect of that.
Yeah, and like going to more Naughty Dog games, I feel like they have a very good way of sort of hinting to the player what they should be doing without directly saying you need to go to X, Y, and Z place. Like they do that, especially with having NPCs in a particular scene. So Uncharted is and also one of my most favorite franchises of all time. But in when I'm exploring the landscapes of Scotland in Uncharted 4, while Sam Drake is right next to me, he's like, "Oh, maybe we should head towards this particular place." I remember it being vaguely on our map, or even in like the first 3 games. It's like, "Oh, maybe you should take a look at your journal. Maybe that might give you a clue as to where to go," without directly telling the player like, "You need to do this, to do this, to do this."
Yes. I always think that's really nice where you have, I guess, some gentle reminding through voiceover. It's I think a really nice way of doing that. And I suppose it's also something which it's quite nice because also if players are maybe a bit visually impaired as well, you can kind of have some voiceover to help give them a bit of some more hints of what to do. I think accessibility is another quite interesting like I suppose feature of UI, or often is something which a lot of games are now looking at doing. Sort of thinking about as going even further, how can you produce a good experience? Trying to think about maybe if players are have various things they find harder to do, whether it's so if you're slightly visually impaired, there are things you can do, like giving the options to increase text sizes, change colors. So if you have color blindness, you can, in some games, you can choose a wide range of settings. And I think that's another really interesting part of games that are now being explored a lot more seriously now.
Yeah, I can see that as well with like the example that you used with The Last of Us Part 2, seeing as it was nominated for one of the most accessible games to date. And it has options such as heat maps, so you know where the NPCs are, and increasing the text of just all the text that you can see in the player's HUD, as well as giving the text itself like a shadow or not a shadow, just so then there's that real separation between what's going on in the mise en scene, as you would, or versus what the player can actually see. So it's good to see the accessibility increase with the modern day games and titles, just so then more people can play it and more people can enjoy games, because I feel like UI is sort of the key to unlocking more players to experience more games.
Yes, and one of the things which I've often heard as well, when you do add accessibility options to games, it's been said that actually like large numbers of players who I suppose wouldn't consider themselves to have any kind of disability will still use these things like text size increases. Quite a large percentage of players will use those. Certainly with things like Red Dead Redemption 2, they had some color change settings, and that was something which I had turned on just because the colors that they had originally were just quite hard to see, quite hard to read. So I had the kind of easier to read version on. So it's something which everyone can use, like whoever you are, which I think is nice.
Yeah, and I found that no matter what game I play, whether it's an online game, a simple indie game, or a big AAA game like God of War, for example, before I even start the game, I immediately turn on the subtitles, because even though I can hear what the players, what the characters are saying, it's good to actually being able to read that, to know exactly what I'm listening to, who's saying it, because if there's lots of characters in one scene, it's hard to tell who is saying what, especially if they all have similar voices and voice tones. So yeah, it's good to have accessibility options for those who want to just jump into the game, whether they maybe need them or don't need them. So it's good to have that UI option to hop into the accessibility options before you jump into the game.
Yes, definitely.
But with that, I was kind of curious. With some UI, you can get like the perfect amount. Like you, I feel like some games don't have too much UI, and they give the player just the right amount of what they need. So I'm curious, for you, when should elements of the HUD be hidden to reduce clutter on a player's screen?
Yes, I think that's a really interesting question. There's, I guess, there's a kind of time and a place, I suppose, sometimes for this stuff. As in say for example, during players' first time user experience, so that time when they're first joining the game and they're learning about the game, you may want to hide like a lot of key bits of HUD, or bits from the menu, so that when they're looking at something for the first time, especially if some features aren't available to them initially, it can be quite a good idea to just be as clean as possible, so they can say just focus on the gameplay. And then say as you are teaching certain things, you might introduce new bits of information in the HUD and say, oh, this is your character's magic bar or something. If they haven't needed to use magic or anything, initially, they don't need to see that information. And I think it can be confusing if a player starts the game and they have all of that information up front. They can kind of just get distracted and get confused. Whereas if you can nicely kind of bring in those bits one at a time, I think that's a good general way to start. In terms of, say, as a kind of final game thing, you could have, say, some games, they give you options of how much HUD you want to see. Trying to remember a game I was playing that did that. Ghost Recon Breakpoint, that had some options for you to have some stuff shown on the HUD or not. I think some HUD things had keyboard shortcuts you could use to toggle things on and off. And that was an interesting way of I guess giving the player more control over what they see. I think some games as well, like they're quite moddable for players. I think like some MMOs, like players just create their own mods of what they want to see.
Yeah, like I dabble a little bit in playing World of Warcraft, and I'll definitely be rebooting it up once Dragonflight comes out. But I've installed a few mods myself just so then I can have the information of who is doing the most damage when I enter a raid, or having the option to see all of my bag at once rather than seeing different sections of my bag, just so then all my items can just go into one thing and I can see them all. And I think the one thing that World of Warcraft does quite well is that you're able to minimize all of the UI once you're done with it, and you can reopen it through like hotkeys, just so then like if I want to see my player really quickly and the cool outfit that they are wearing, which by the way is very cool, fire mage with big flames on her head, it's very cool. I can just click P, and then once I'm like, oh yep, she's still cool, I can click P again and just minimize the little player visual pop-up.
Yes, so that's a really good example. I think it depends on the game as well, I guess, as well. So I think if you were going for something quite minimal, or I guess like where the game is quite artistic, you might want to, I suppose, have I suppose not too moddable kind of UIs. I'm trying to think of like say some games.
Like Slime Rancher, for example.
Oh, what game is that? Sorry.
So Slime Rancher is a game that I've been playing recently, and there is little to no UI on like what the player sees just by walking around in the world, and they only really see the stuff that they've currently got inside their little Hoover gun. And once all of those slots are filled, it's like, oh, I've got to go deposit all the stuff that I have, and it's just a case of there being two states for each of the slot. It's either it has stuff in it or it's empty.
Yes. So I think that's a kind of, using like a very minimal UI, so you can just focus on the I guess the game experience, the playing experience itself. And I think some games that they've got quite artistic UIs as well, which I think don't open themselves too much to modding. So say, remember the name of the game. What's it called? I can't remember it.
I mean, to be fair, there are a lot of games out there, and thankfully there's so many that do fall under the explanation that you're achieving.
Yeah. One of the games I can think of an example now, like Transistor. That was a very beautiful game, very beautiful UI.
Mm-hmm.
And I think to create something artistic like that, it was as if all of the UIs were kind of created specifically for those screens. Everything kind of fitted together. And so I think it wasn't so much about modding, it was kind of like a whole experience of the look of the game. It was kind of, it's game set in kind of, I'm trying to think how I describe it, like a kind of futuristic 1930s sort of, I don't know what you call it, like it's almost steampunk, but more futuristic. But it had a really lovely UIs with really nice backgrounds. But the UI was very visible there, but I think it was very much part of the art of the game. It's very beautiful.
Yeah, and I feel like you can almost see similar things with like other titles such as Persona 5, where the UI is so unique for its world and the design of the game, is that I don't feel like it wouldn't work in any other game, because Persona 5 has a sort of like quick action sort of style. Once you're in the combat, it really draws the player in, and I feel like it really translates well in what the developers are trying to communicate to the players.
Yes, definitely. But Persona 5's UI, it's very iconic. Some people, I think, have even cosplayed as the UI. I think that's that kind of level, and that's a really interesting one, because the UI is very much like a part of the game. It's really in your face. It's it's almost like the exact opposite of those kind of barely there UIs. So it's interesting. You can see that the range that you can get, and I think it depends on what the game is going for, I suppose, like how I suppose loud or quiet you want those experiences of going through menus to be.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I am curious as well, because there are so many different genres in video games. Do you reckon all of the skills of making unique UI for a particular franchise could translate into other mediums, such as like TVs, applications, and movies?
Yeah, certainly. But we're seeing now, like in I think like Netflix has done a few like interactive television shows. There was like a Black Mirror one. What was it called? I can't remember.
I do remember that one, and the name has also slipped my mind, but I do remember that being an intense episode of Black Mirror.
But yes, you're now looking at interactive television shows where obviously the UI for those would need to be something that's not too distracting, or a whole part of the immersion of the show, if that's what you would need. And yeah, you're looking like, I think nowadays we're looking at like more UI on things. You obviously have, your smartwatches, which they have a whole nother interesting interaction methods. That your screen is so small that you can't show information the same way you would on a mobile phone or anything like that. So I think that those, I suppose, having to design for users on various other, I guess, devices, you might call them. Yeah, you definitely are going to have to think about those things. I haven't had a smart fridge, but I definitely heard about people having games and stuff on their
I mean,
smart
if I could play
fridges.
Doodle Jump on a fridge one day, I think I'd be a very happy bunny. I'm
So
almost
yeah.
picturing as well when we're talking about UI in movies, because you don't see it very much once the movie plays. But I remember there used to be a phase in movies, especially on DVDs, where once you would open the disc, essentially, like once you put it in like a disc reader, you'd have like a UI for playing the movie, the scene selections, and maybe behind the scenes. And I remember one of the most iconic ones, with one of my favorite movies of all time that I can never stop talking about, is for Scooby-Doo, Spooky Island. And even when you would like switch between the different buttons, they would like highlight differently, and you can see the visual difference. And I remember that being so well suited for the thing that I was about to consume as a user, that it still sticks into my brain now.
Wow, nice. Yeah, I think I have these kind of quite, I guess, different memories from I was trying to interact with DVDs. And sometimes you might find that the experience being really frustrating. You're trying to find maybe a chapter or something, or even trying to get the film to play, sometimes not being immediately obvious. So you get quite a range. And like you're saying with the Scooby-Doo film, like if you can get one that is really setting up your experience for watching the film, you can see that there's been some thought that has gone into that, which I think is nice to have now. And
Yeah, and I
obviously,
feel like with like big modern movies such as the Avengers, for example, you don't get it as playful as you would with like the Scooby-Doo movie, for example. But I feel like because that movie sort of like with the Avengers, it sort of has a somewhat serious tone. You can't have big playful buttons or a big picture of Scooby Doo or a tiki mask to be like, yeah, let's go watch the Avengers. um, so I feel like you said earlier, it really has to sort of mold to the audience and make sure the audience itself wants to interact with this UI, and make sure that it really sets the tone of what the player or the user is about to consume.
yes, definitely. I think that's where art can kind of come in as well, as in you can get maybe something which is, say, a framework, as in you can design how something's going to be interacted with, but definitely the art side, you could end up, I suppose, having to make sure it's working for your audience. As in, I imagine some of these DVD companies, but maybe there's a kind of a framework underneath, and then someone's skinning that to the movie, as in creating some kind of cover, whether it's Scooby-Doo or Avengers. And it's kind of interesting seeing how you can create the same underlying navigations, and how the feeling of that for the user can be totally different. So that's interesting.
So I would be curious as well, because learning more about how a UI really translates into the project that it's about to unlock for the user, how would you, like, what would you advise people who are trying to get into UI, and how would they go about practicing making UI for a particular subject or genre of a particular piece of media?
Oh, right. I guess for someone who's getting into trying to create some UI, I definitely would suggest, I guess, looking at other games, or I guess the media that you're going to be creating interfaces for. Like just sometimes just copying them, you can learn quite a lot, just for your own personal portfolio. In terms of, say, going about creating like some piece of UI, say if you have a game that you're working on, I would definitely suggest, a bit of lightning there. That's really weird. I definitely suggest going through a process where you look at the user experience first. So creating wireframes, those are kind of black and white, artless versions of some UI. So usually grey boxes, so something that has no art. It's just about information, and focusing on that first. And then once you're happy with that, then moving on to the art specific part. So then I guess translating that into something that looks like something you would have in the game. So I would definitely suggest doing that.
Nice. And for people who were trying to get into UI, are there any programs or apps, or it's anything like that you'd recommend them using for the first time, whether it's something that might be free or something that is maybe like more of a price tag?
I would definitely suggest, I'm trying to think, say for people who are, I guess, already have an Adobe suite, there's like Adobe XD for creating, say, like prototypes. So these are sort of clickable versions of a UI before it's gone into any project. So you can kind of create UI designs and then set them up. There was also a program for prototyping that I used to really like, called Flinto. I think it's still around, and that had, I think it had £100 like one-off price tag, so you could pay once for that, and that was really good. Also, when you're creating UI in, say, Photoshop or Illustrator, or whichever these programs you'd like to use, using guides and grids are really helpful at creating like well-aligned UI layouts. There was a program I used to use called Guide that I think that's still available. I think it might be a subscription now, but it was, because I think they're a small company, it's quite inexpensive, and you could create, say, grids of, you could put in any number you wanted, but that was really useful for me. So yeah, I definitely say, in terms of just getting into it, if you're interested in maybe becoming a UI artist, I guess from whichever route you're going, if you're more of a 2D concept artist type person, that's still useful skills that you can make use of, because sometimes in games, you, as a UI artist, you might still have to create a lot of 2D icons, 2D art. If you need to create some, so an example, you might need to create some currency, some nice piles of currencies, stuff that looks nice. So there'll be some UI and 2D art involved in that. If you're a graphic designer, like lots of people from the design industry go into doing UI, certainly creating some portfolio pieces. So you can imagine, like, if you had an app or a game, if you have a think about how the player would use that, they really think about that side of things, creating a whole flow of screens that could all be used together. That kind of thing is really good. It's what, when someone's looking at portfolios for hiring, that's what they're looking for. So someone who's really thinking about how the game would work and what players would want. So yes.
And I feel like a good way to almost put those skills into practice, or put the practice into practice, would be having participate or put your name forwards for game jams, because even just getting a quick brief as to what a game is about to be, it really helps figure out what your brief for UI would be, and then you can sort of see your UI in action, and then you could be like, oh, I made the UI for X, Y, and Z game jam, and it came 7th out of 7,000 or something, as an example.
Yes, that's actually a really good thing to it's a good thing to do anytime. But yeah, certainly, like, if you're starting out, it really gives you something tangible to show, and also that you've learnt to work in a team as well, which there's a really insane storm happening at the moment. Massive forks of lightning. Yes, sorry. So when you're doing game jams, it gives you a really good bit of real life experience of making a game, and obviously having a deadline like that is really good for kind of getting you and the team to kind of get together and create something out of that. And even like in the past, I've done some game jams and have managed to, say, take things that if they were rushed at the time, you can then polish them up afterwards and put them in your portfolio. That's the kind of thing that I've done in the past as well.
Yeah,
So,
and that way it sort of shows like the growth that you have for a UI, and you can UI artist, and you can say like, oh, I got feedback from these particular assets that I made, so I then went back, redid them, and made them better.
Yes, yeah. So I think that's a really good one.
Well, it appears that I have run out of questions to ask you, Steffi. That, and I'm also hearing the storm my end as well. So I shall conclude this episode of the Game Dev London podcast and the chat about UI. But if anyone has anything else that they would like to discuss, feel free to pop a comment in the description below, or check out the Game Dev London Discord, where we can continue our discussions. And big thank you to Steffi as well for being my guest today. And Steffi, where can people go and find more about you?
Oh, yes. Well, yeah, thank you for having me. Yeah, you can find me. I've got a website, which is just steffiegarcia.com. It's just a Behance page. And also you can find me on LinkedIn as well, and Twitter as well. I think I'm just Steffie_Garcia on there. So you can find me there. So yeah, thank you.
Well, yeah, thank you so much for being on the podcast today. I feel like I've learned so much about UI, and it's just interesting learning more and more about UI every day, and how it intertwines with different disciplines of making a game.
Ah, yes, it is. It's very intertwined. It's got deep roots that wrap around everything in the nicest way.
Diegetic roots that intertwine with the project. Well, yeah, thank you so much for listening, and thanks to everyone who has tuned in. Be sure to check out the Game Dev London Discord and Twitter account for the latest updates. Otherwise, I hope you enjoy your day or evening whenever you listen to this episode, and we shall see you at the same time next week.
Okay.
Bye-bye.